Hopefully I'm loud enough. Can you hear me? All right. Well then, I'd like to begin by thanking everyone associated with the College of Arts and Sciences. Thank Dean Eisenberg for that wonderful introduction. In fact, I'm thinking about asking him to be on retainer if you want to introduce me everywhere. Absolutely. That'd be wonderful. And hello? How's that? All right. We'll give it another shot. And I'd also like to, when I came to the University of South Florida in 2010, I got really lucky because my parents live here in Tampa. And so I just wanted to express appreciation over the fact that my parents got to be here tonight. They're right there, Suzanne and Dennis. So I want to begin with this image, which I'm guessing many of you are familiar with. It is perhaps the most iconic image in the history of sports. And if you don't know much about it, it was taken in 1968 in Mexico City, just after the gold medal, or the medal event in the 200-meter sprint. Here you have on the podium Australian Peter Norman on the left. He won the silver medal. Gold medalist Tommie Smith and bronze medalist John Carlos. Now this image is significant because it comprises essentially the American athlete's entrance into the political stage, into modern political speech. And it also gives me an opportunity to introduce myself as a rhetorical scholar. I was trained to study rhetoric. Now, many people think that rhetoric is just BS, and in many cases it is. But rhetoric is also the study of the various ways in which how we put things matters. And what that means is that as a rhetorical scholar, what I study is human symbol use, the way that human beings use symbols to alter reality, to change events, and to intervene in social and political affairs. And this image is important for a rhetorical scholar because it's symbolically rich. There's a lot more going on here than just these black raised fists, and I want to point out just a couple of things. First of all, just the placement of the figures themselves. Here's a white sprinter, right, Peter Norman, sharing a podium with two black colleagues. Now you might think that he's sort of the odd man out here, but he's not, because he's wearing right here a patch, and that patch is the symbol for the Olympic Project for Human Rights, and that patch is being worn by these other two men, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, themselves who helped found the Olympic Project for Human Rights. And I'm going to talk about that project in just a second, but I want to talk about some other dimensions of this image. One is Tommie Smith, if you notice, if you look closely, he's wearing a black scarf. And that's the symbol that he intended to mean black power. It wasn't the fists. The fists, according to Carlos and Smith, meant unity. They just stood for unity. It was the scarf that was meant to stand for black power. There are a variety of other things going on as well. Carlos here has his jacket unzipped, and it was meant to express solidarity with blue-collar workers back in the United States. The beads that Carlos wore around his neck were meant to symbolize slaves that died in the journey of the Middle Passage during the times of slavery. And what you can't see here is that Carlos and Smith, they're not wearing shoes. They were just wearing black socks. And that was meant to symbolize solidarity with those who experienced poverty back in the United States. So as a rhetorical scholar, this image is incredibly significant because it's symbolically rich. But I'm not just interested in images that provide us with sort of all sorts of symbolic cues. I'm also interested in individuals who happen to have lived their lives as symbols. And I've done a lot of work recently on Jackie Robinson, and most of you probably know why Jackie Robinson is symbolically significant. He integrated the major leagues in 1947 by signing with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was signed by Branch Rickey. And of course, Jackie Robinson's life was, in fact, in many ways, lived as a symbol. His main biographer is a man named Jules Tygeel, who wrote a book in 1983 called Baseball's Great Experiment. And in Baseball's Great Experiment, Tygeel argued that Jackie Robinson operates as a metaphor for American race relations, as a metaphor for the various ways in which we're supposed to imagine ourselves as progressive and racially conscious people in the modern age. And in many ways, Jackie Robinson's life was a testament to the truth of integration, its social truth, its political truth, its economic truth, and of course, its moral truth. And Jackie Robinson, in fact, once described himself as a laboratory specimen. But he didn't describe himself as a laboratory specimen in 1947. He described himself as a laboratory specimen in 1949. In 1949, Jackie Robinson made an appearance. Most folks don't know this about him. He made an appearance in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was invited to speak to the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is before Joe McCarthy. A man named John S. Wood was running the House Un-American Activities Committee back then. And there was concern among some members of Congress that perhaps the cause of civil rights was being agitated by communists. Right? And part of this was inflamed by a man named Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was perhaps the most famous black man in the world in the first half of the 20th century. And Paul Robeson was an athlete. He played football at Rutgers, and then he went on to become a famous stage actor and toured London, in fact, toured Russia. And while he was in Russia, what he found, what was interesting about his trip to Russia is what he didn't find. What he didn't find in Russia was racism. And so he identified with the masses, he identified with the working class, and came home as a communist. Well, he was vilified and demonized and everything else. And so when he announced at a Paris peace conference that no self-respecting Negro would fight against the Russians, well, this got Congress very worried, right? Especially since World War II has just ended and the Cold War is just beginning. So who did Congress call? Jackie Robinson. Now, what you might not know about Jackie Robinson is that he served in the Army. And in fact, he was court-martialed in 1944. This is a good decade before Rosa Parks, for refusing to take a seat on the back of a bus, on the back of an Army bus. Now, he was eventually acquitted during his court-martial, but Jackie Robinson was a believer in America. And this sort of symbolizes, this image to me symbolizes Jackie Robinson's participation in politics. And the contrast with Carlos Smith is important, because what Carlos Smith did was what we might call protest, right? It was angry, it was defiant, it was resistant, it upset people deliberately. Jackie Robinson wasn't there to upset people. Jackie Robinson was there to participate. And what I want to suggest is that there are two ways in which athletes engage in politics. One is through protest. The other is through participation. And Jackie Robinson was a lifelong participant in politics. After his appearance at HUAC, he played baseball for about 7 more years. He retired in 1956. And then he went on to campaign for Richard Nixon in 1960. He was a lifelong supporter of Nelson Rockefeller. He wrote a weekly column in a black newspaper in New York called the New York Amsterdam News. And he wrote opinions on all kinds of things: politics, culture, society, and occasionally even sports. But Jackie Robinson was a model of participation. He died in 1972 at the young age of 53, but not before he had plenty of things to say. By the end of his life, he was making a case for why there should be a black manager in baseball. That would happen in 1975 when Frank Robinson was hired by the Baltimore Orioles. Now, this is 40-some-odd years ago, right? And so the question is, what is the status of contemporary athletes? And where do contemporary athletes stand in relation to politics? Now, some worry that, in fact, contemporary athletes, they're not so much into politics. That contemporary athletes, as one commentator has pointed out, have been etherized by wealth. That is, contemporary athletes are too busy playing golf with their rich friends to give a damn about an important social or political cause. In fact, very recently, a historian at the University of Texas by the name of Leonard Moore wrote, "These brothers have this warped idea that they've been given something. Some of these guys are recruited to private schools in high school, and fear starts right there. They're taught in many ways to stay quiet, just play ball, and make money because the system does reward that. Because the system rewards just making money." Now, who are the two iconic representatives of just making money by playing sports and avoiding politics? They are, of course, Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan. Right? Now, there's Jordan chomping on a cigar and walking the links. Now, we all know about Tiger Woods' troubles, and I don't want to repeat any of those, but Michael Jordan was asked in 1990, when he was, at the time, probably the most famous human being on the planet, to lend a small measure of support to a man named Harvey Gantt, the first black man ever admitted to Clemson University, and running for the U.S. Senate against Jesse Helms, right, who, of course, at one time ran a notorious segregationist platform. Right? They asked Jordan, Gantt supporters asked Jordan, "You want to help us maybe support Gantt against Jesse Helms?" And the now infamous response from Michael Jordan was, "Republicans buy sneakers too." Right? So Michael Jordan decided to stay out of politics, and these have become the kind of iconic figures for the opposite of Carlos and Smith and Jackie Robinson. That is, athletes who have been etherized by wealth. Now, I think it's unfair to take shots at Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods. I think that maybe that's something that we want to recoil at, right? But while Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods might not reflect the values and the activism of their predecessors, they do in fact avail themselves of the possibilities, right, that their predecessors gave them. In other words, they take advantage of what their predecessors allowed. And it's very difficult to condemn these men for doing that, right? But there are in fact instances of athletic activism that exist today. You don't have to look very far. Well, you have to look kind of hard to find them. My guess that nobody knows who this man is. This is a man. Maybe this helps. There he is playing football for the University of Virginia. His name is Joseph Williams, a walk-on football player for the University of Virginia. Joseph Williams grew up in a difficult household in difficult circumstances, but was bright and got himself into the University of Virginia. And when he got to the University of Virginia, he decided he was going to play football. So he walked onto the team, made the team, right? But he also is an accomplished student, a political science major, and got involved with something called the Living Wage Campaign. And the Living Wage Campaign is working to help people out of poverty, people who have jobs and work full-time but don't make enough to earn a living. And Joseph Williams was incredibly interested by this. And the Living Wage Campaign decided to engage in a hunger strike in support of minimum wage workers, the janitors and the like at the University of Virginia, right, who didn't make enough to earn a living. And so Joseph Williams, a football player, decided to engage in a hunger strike. And he actually continued this hunger strike for 14 days. Now, it turns out that he was scheduled to make a trip abroad, and he was going to have to eat in order to make that trip abroad. And so he eventually ended his hunger strike, right? But Joseph Williams stands as an example, but he's a difficult example to find, right? I mean, you have to look really hard to find people like Joseph Williams. Now, in many ways, Joseph Williams embodies that spirit of protest maybe that we get from John Carlos and Tommy Smith in Mexico City in 1968. But when it comes to the participation aspect, there are, of course, other contemporary athletes that we can look towards. This man here, shaking hands with Barack Obama, is being thanked by the president for having filmed a video in support of the president's re-election campaign in 2012. He's Victor Cruz, the star wide receiver for the New York Giants. Right? Victor Cruz, there he is, he was supporting Barack Obama. And you might figure that this is something that Jackie Robinson might have done, make a 30-second video in support of his favorite candidate if there were YouTube, right, in 1960. But there wasn't. But Victor Cruz is a participant in politics, and I don't know, this is Bill Nye the Science Guy. I don't know if you recognize him. He just happens to be in the shot. There's also Chris Kluwe. Chris Kluwe was a longtime punter for the Minnesota Vikings. He actually can still punt. He's just out of the game. And he's out of the game, he believes, because of his outspoken advocacy for the rights of gays and lesbians, not only in sports, but in general. He supports gay marriage and writes a regular column in an online magazine called Deadspin in order to make his case loudly and often. And he believes he's been blackballed by the NFL because of his advocacy. And of course, we heard Dean Eisenberg mention Michael Sam, right? And so the work that Chris Kluwe is trying to do is to try to protect the likes of Michael Sam as they enter sports in the coming decades. And I think that Michael Sam, much like Jackie Robinson, might learn very soon what it means to live life as a symbol. But I want to go back. I want to go back a little bit. I want to go back through time to the 1960s. I want to link today to the past, all right? Because there is, as I said, concern that the activist athlete has been lost to history. Now, the thing is that the issues of the past are not the issues of the present. The issues of the past are not the issues of the present. We don't need Jackie Robinson making his case, at least not in the way that he made it anymore. And we certainly, maybe we don't need John Carlos and Tommy Smith to make their case in the way that they made it, right? But there is nevertheless nostalgia. And this nostalgia we hear from a number of places. Turn on ESPN for a half an hour, you'll find this nostalgia for the activist athlete. And it seems to me that this nostalgia is linked to four things that I want to say comprises an ethos, a way of being, a mode of citizenship, a way of engaging politics, right? A kind of personality that speaks with courage and conviction and risk, right? And I want to argue that this ethos of the activist athlete is comprised of four things historically speaking. These four things are experience, solidarity, risk, and poetry. But in order to come to terms with each of these things, I want to sort of run through a number of figures here. And to come to terms with what I mean by experience, we have to get to know a man named Harry Edwards. Harry Edwards was a Cornell-educated sociologist, and he was a San Jose State basketball player in the early 1960s. He went off to Cornell. He was an incredible student. He went off to Cornell, started a PhD program, and then came back to San Jose State on a teaching appointment. And he came back to San Jose State where he met two young track and field athletes, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, right? And Harry Edwards here attended a youth conference with Carlos and Smith in Los Angeles in 1967. And out of that youth conference, grew a kind of mood of disillusionment and dissatisfaction, not only with the way in which black athletes were treated, but the way in which black folks were treated in the United States. And so Harry Edwards and John Carlos and Tommie Smith got together and they had an idea. The idea was, let's organize an international black boycott of the Olympic Games. That is to say, they wanted, right, to achieve the type of protest which would keep all black athletes away from the Mexico City Olympic Games. Right? Now, the trouble here for Harry Edwards was that when you talk about athletes who've been working their entire lives to achieve one single goal, right, they may have believed in the political program, but they weren't going to avoid Mexico City. Right? But what they did was they agreed to engage in a form of symbolism, and everyone agreed to do their own form of protest. And you might say that Harry Edwards symbolically escorted John Carlos and Tommie Smith to that medal podium in 1968. Now, by 1969, Harry Edwards was, at this point, is a very good sociologist. Harry Edwards founded a field known as the sociology of sport, without which, I'll be completely honest here, I wouldn't have a job if there were no such thing as the sociology of sport, right? But there is, and it's because of Harry Edwards, right? And Harry Edwards wrote a manifesto in 1969 that he called the Revolt of the Black Athlete, that was meant to encapsulate and capture and summarize the ideas and the experiences that grew out of 1968. And what I want to do is share with you something that Harry Edwards wrote in the Revolt of the Black Athlete. He wrote, "The athletic revolt springs from a disgust and dissatisfaction with the same racist germ that infected the warped minds responsible for the bomb murders of 4 black girls as they prayed in a Birmingham, Alabama church, and that conceived and carried out the murders of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Medgar Evers, among a multitude of others. The revolt of the black athlete arises also from his awareness of his responsibilities in an increasingly more desperate, violent, and unstable America. He is for the first time reacting in a human and masculine fashion to the disparities between the heady artificial world of newspaper clippings, photographers, and screaming spectators, and the real world of degradation, humiliation, and horror that confronts the overwhelming majority of Afro-Americans. An even more immediate call to arms for many black Americans has been their realization that once their athletic abilities are impaired by age or injury, only the ghetto beckons, and they are doomed once again to that faceless, hopeless, ignominious existence they had supposedly forever left behind them." So when I talk about experience, I'm not talking about any kind of experience. We all have experiences. But I'm talking about the kind of experience that leads to what W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903 called double consciousness. W.E.B. Du Bois, writing The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, said that black folks in the United States saw how white folks saw them. And this led to a keenness, a sensitivity toward injustice, an ability to see things that ordinary folks couldn't because they couldn't take the way they saw themselves for granted. And it seems to me that what Harry Edwards narrated in The Revolt of the Black Athletes is this sense of double consciousness. Experience leads to awareness, and that awareness produces an activist's conscience. Now, this fact of experience is what contemporary athletes are said to lack. Contemporary athletes, they're identified as superior athletes. They're put aside and socialized away from activism. Now, whether that's the case or not, I think that's debatable. But experience is what contemporary athletes are said to lack. The second dimension of the ethos of the activist athlete is what I want to call solidarity. The man on the left you may recognize, that is Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali won a gold medal in boxing in Rome in 1960. In 1962, he met Malcolm X. They became pals. Malcolm X became his mentor. He was given the name Cassius X. Right? In 1964, Muhammad Ali knocked out Sonny Liston and became the heavyweight champion of the world and was given the name Muhammad Ali. Right? 1967, as the heavyweight champion of the world, he was drafted to go to Vietnam. And he said he didn't want to go. And the reason that he said he didn't want to go is because he was a conscientious objector. His religious beliefs prohibited him from going. Now, the thing is that many folks saw this as a trick, a ruse, a gambit, right, to keep himself out of Vietnam and keep the money flowing in the U.S. as he was a terrific boxer, right? And so a man named Jim Brown became very interested in Muhammad Ali. This is Jim Brown here on the right. Jim Brown was the great Cleveland Browns running back, retired as the all-time leading rusher in NFL history. And Jim Brown retired in 1965. Some folks say too early. He was still in the prime of his career. But Jim Brown retired in 1965, and by 1967 had formed something called the Black Economic Union, which was an organization that was designed to serve the economic interests of black folks in major cities around the U.S., but it was headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio. And so Jim Brown decided that he wanted to get together with Muhammad Ali and see if Ali meant it. If this business about being a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War was something that Ali took seriously. Because if it was the case, then the Black Economic Union was behind him. Right? Well, they interrogated Ali. They met together. They hung out. And actually, they had about a 4-hour meeting. By the end of the 4-hour meeting, there was a press conference, and everybody was there to hear how this meeting went. And what you can see here is that it wasn't just Jim Brown and Muhammad Ali sitting in a room talking together. It was a group of men joined by Bill Russell, the Boston Celtics basketball champion, right? The first, by the way, ever black head coach in NBA history. And over here, young Lou Alcindor, who would later become Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And in the back, and forgive me if I don't know all their names, are various members of the Cleveland Browns football team and the Green Bay Packers. One of these guys up here is Willie Brown, who played for the Packers and beat my beloved Chicago Bears on many occasions. But Jim Brown, Muhammad Ali, together with all these athletes, and I think that the striking lesson from this image is solidarity. They were working together. And not only were they working together, they were sharing risk. Ali's battle was not Jim Brown's, but Ali was willing to throw his support behind Ali because they could share the risks together. And it reveals the idea that the activist athlete engaged in collective action because people working together are always stronger than people working alone. Right? Now, speaking of working alone, I want to discuss the idea of risk, which, as I see it, is the third dimension of the activist athlete. For those of you who don't know, and this is maybe a more unfamiliar face, this is Curt Flood. Curt Flood was an outfielder for the St. Louis Cardinals from 1960 to 1969. He was a terrific ball player. 1968, Sports Illustrated called him the best center fielder in baseball, while Willie Mays was still in the game. And Curt Flood was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies at the end of the 69 season, and he didn't want to go. He didn't want to go for a couple of reasons. One is his life was in St. Louis. His business interests were in St. Louis. Right? The second reason he didn't want to go is because he didn't want to be told where to go and when to go there. Now, at the time, there was no such thing as free agency in baseball. Players couldn't just get a new, better contract somewhere else. In baseball, the rule was every year that you played for a team, you signed a contract, and that contract said, next year, I'm playing for that team too. Right? Players didn't have a choice. So Curt Flood sued Major League Baseball for his right to become what we now call a free agent. Many people say that Curt Flood paved the way for free agency in professional sports. And that might be true, but what I think is interesting about Curt Flood's case is what he said about himself in 1969. He said, when he wrote a letter to the Commissioner of Baseball, he said, "I am not a piece of property to be bought or sold irrespective of my wishes. Not a piece of property." And then, right, in 1970, he went on television with Howard Cosell, the notorious Howard Cosell. And Howard Cosell says, "Curt, you make $90,000 a year. That's not slave wages. What's your reply to that?" And Curt Flood's reply was, "A well-paid slave is nonetheless a slave." Well, as you can imagine, this angered many people, especially the people who ran Major League Baseball. People who ran Major League Baseball were very upset because they saw themselves, hey, baseball gave us Jackie Robinson. We are America's progressive institution. He angered many people, and many of his colleagues were afraid to be on his side. They figured that if they threw their weight behind Curt Flood, that they would be on the outside looking in too, themselves out of a job. Now, he tried to forge a coalition, and the Major League Baseball Players Association, which at the time was composed of 24 white men who didn't quite yet have a union, these 24 men agreed to pay his legal bills, but they didn't show up at his trial. When the federal court trial happened in 1970, not a single current player showed up at Curt Flood's trial. Not a single one. Now, Jackie Robinson hobbled in. He was sort of at the end of his life. His body was ravaged by diabetes, right? And he said that Curt Flood had a case, but not a single current player supported Curt Flood. Curt Flood was run out of baseball. In 1972, the case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against him. Curt Flood was off in Europe, broke and beaten, and becoming an alcoholic. He eventually came back to the United States. He was sent back home to the United States in the late 1970s on the State Department's dime. He was a drunk. He had nothing but the shirt on his back and his dog. Curt Flood put everything on the line. He put his wealth on the line. He put his sense of himself on the line. He put a future in baseball on the line. He was eventually recognized by the players in the 1990s once they got themselves very, very rich because he made it possible. But Curt Flood took risks. The last dimension of the activist athlete that I want to mention Sorry, one other thing. I have a book. It's called Curt Flood in the Media, Baseball Racing the Demise of the Activist Athlete. It's available on Amazon. Feel free to buy it when you leave. All right. The last dimension of the activist athlete that I want to discuss is poetry. We might not necessarily see poetry as being, well, associated with sports, right? Athletes are, well, they're violent, right? Poetry is beautiful, right? But poetry, I think, is maybe best captured by the image of Muhammad Ali. Now, if you have any familiarity with Muhammad Ali, then you are surely aware of his rhyming boasts, right? Muhammad Ali could spin a yarn and tell a tale and talk in grandiose ways about himself, right? And that had a certain poetic quality to it, right? There was a certain beauty to that, right? But in addition to that, it seems to me that Muhammad Ali inspired others to think differently, right? Certainly Muhammad Ali had a poetic quality that he helped to capture, a rhythmic voice, and he was beautiful. But Muhammad Ali also encapsulated and embodied everything contained in that late 60s slogan, "Black is beautiful." Right? He animated that very simple statement with its own form of poetry. Now, keep in mind that Muhammad Ali resisted the draft in 1967. 1967. The revolt of the black athlete happened in 1968. Harry Edwards wrote the book on the revolt of the black athlete in 1969. And when he wrote the book, this is what he had to say about Muhammad Ali. He said, "Special mention is due Muhammad Ali, for in a very real sense, he is the saint of this revolution in sports. He rebelled at a time when he, as an athlete, stood alone. He lost almost everything of value to any athlete, his prestige, his income, and his title, but he maintained and enhanced the most crucial factor in the minds of black people everywhere, black dignity. For a significant proportion of people, black people in particular, he is still champion and the warrior saint in the revolt of the black athlete in America." That's Muhammad Ali, your warrior saint. And I think to talk of Ali's poetry, is to, at least for me, is to get past just the fact that he was good at making rhymes about himself, that he was a precursor to what the kids these days call rap, right? But what Muhammad Ali did, right, was draw you in. Muhammad Ali was seductive. Muhammad Ali had charisma. Muhammad Ali appealed to what Aristotle once called invention. Muhammad Ali was creative. Muhammad Ali appealed to what a literary scholar named Michael Warner calls poetic world-making. What I mean by that is that Ali saw a world that he didn't fit in. And so he spoke the world that he wanted into existence and invited you to live in it. And that's poetry. And that's, I think, the crucial dimension of the activist athlete, that ethos of the activist athlete that many contemporary athletes struggle with today. Speak the world you want into existence. Don't just react, but make it happen. Invent it with symbols and language and with beauty and with creativity. Well, this gets us back to the present, right? So here we are taking our trip back through the wormhole to 2012. Now, this is the Miami Heat basketball team. Miami Heat basketball team. And this is the Miami Heat basketball team wearing their hoodies in order to express, well, a certain political statement about the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. Now, you could say that this image of the Miami Heat, this is an important image, and this image circulated widely. If you have a Facebook account, you saw this image, right? This image circulated widely. But in my view, in many ways, it's rapid circulation that in many ways separates it from the ethos of the demise of the activist athlete. You see it, but it doesn't stick. It enchants, but it doesn't grab hold of you. Right? So you are delighted by it and you pass it along and you ask your friend about it, right? But it doesn't draw you in because in many ways it just crashes into everything else. An entire media landscape that is composed of advertising and managed images, right? Now, whatever statement the Miami Heat are making here, I think it's an important one, and it's one with, if it's an argument, I can agree with the argument, right? But I think one of the things that we have to remember here is that the Miami Heat, they led from behind, right? Miami Heat followed popular sentiment. They didn't manufacture it, right? John Carlos and Tommy Smith manufactured popular sentiment. Muhammad Ali manufactured popular sentiment and drew people in. I think it's a good image and it's an important image, but it's a little different, it seems to me, than the ethos of the activist athlete, at least the one that's embodied in protest. the last thing that I want to share with you when it comes to the contemporary world, and there are countless examples, we can go through many of them. If you don't know this young man, you probably will soon. His name is Kane Coulter. He's the quarterback for the Northwestern University football team. Kane Coulter and his friends came up with an organization. They put together an organization called the College Athletes Players Association. And the point of the College Athletes Players Association is to form a labor union. And in fact, they're in discussions. You see this gentleman here is a representative from the United Steelworkers. They're in discussions with the United Steelworkers to form a labor union. Now, whether you agree with labor unions, whether you disagree with the labor unions, whether you think they're important or whether you think they're not, Kane Coulter and his friends have a challenge here. And the challenge, it seems to me, has to do with that quality of poetic world making. There are two things that they have to do. The first thing that they have to do is they have to speak a world into existence in which they are not just student athletes, in which they are not just guys getting a scholarship, going to school, right, hoping to make ends meet. No, they are laborers. They provide wealth and deliver wealth to their university, and they are not compensated fairly for that wealth. Right? So they have to make the case that they're laborers. The second thing that they have to do is they have to revise the image of labor in America. Right? Now, here's the thing. The legal proceedings will happen and the lawyers will make their case, but if they make their case to the American public, right, then the public will help the lawyers decide what they ought to decide. Right? And so it seems to me that Kane Coulter here, right, going through the routine channels of politics, taking the Jackie Robinson path of participation, Kane Coulter here faces a stiff challenge, and that challenge has to do with poetic world making. Now, I don't know if he'll pull it off. Personally, I'm rooting for him, but he has an uphill battle. And it seems to me that in order for Kane Coulter or any contemporary athlete to engage politics, they need to remember those four things. One more time, they are experience, solidarity, risk, and poetry. Experience that produces double consciousness. Experience that produces an awareness and keenness and sensitivity to injustice. Solidarity, a willingness to work together and share risk with others, engage in collective action. Risk, put it all on the line. Sometimes to achieve something, you have to be willing to lose everything. And finally, poetry. Make the world you want happen. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I understand we have some time for questions. Okay. I need a drink of water anyway.
Well, as you were speaking, I kept thinking about the entertainment industry and the parallels. I was wondering why you chose sports. What in your background made you choose sports?
Well, thank you. That's a biographical question. Okay. I was asked why it is that I chose sports as opposed to any other element of the entertainment industry. It was the summer of 2004. I was just about finished with my doctoral program, and it was time to write a doctoral dissertation. And I got a good advice from an advisor who said, you better write about something that interests you, because if you don't, the next 2 years or so are really going to be bad news for you. So I picked sports because I love sports. I love sports. Yeah.
Please. Obviously, the Michael Sam thing is a big thing in sports, but
yeah.
I'm curious of your thoughts with Jason Collins in the NBA. Mm-hmm. And I know that the new commissioner, Silver, came out and made a comment similar to the Chris Kluwe situation, addressing that. I wanted to know kind of your thoughts on Collins and Silver as the new commissioner stepping forward and making a comment like that.
I haven't heard the latest comment. But Jason Collins, I was asked about Jason Collins. Jason Collins is an NBA player. He's a veteran player. And what's interesting right now is that there have been no openly gay professional athletes to play, right? There have been a number of athletes who came out as gay after retirement, right? But there have been no openly gay professional athletes in the four major North American sports: hockey, football, baseball, and basketball, right? But what we have now at this point is a bookend. Michael Sam, who's about to go into the NFL, right? Hasn't played yet, but he's about to go in. And Jason Collins, who is an NBA player who announced last year that he's gay, but it was while he was a free agent looking for a new contract, right? So Jason Collins still doesn't have a job, and the NBA season started. In fact, last weekend was All-Star weekend, so they're about halfway. But Jason Collins still doesn't have a job. And, you know, it's tough because Jason Collins was not a terrific player, right? I mean, Jason Collins was a good player, a guy who got plenty of playing time in the NBA over the course of about a 10-year career. And so he's certainly qualified to play in the NBA. But I think at this point, the worry from many teams is that Jason Collins brings the kind of attention that detracts from the mission of their team, which is to win a championship and everything else. If he were a better player, right, the case would be different because it would be harder to exclude him, right? But now the problem is that there's this ambiguous area. Why isn't Jason Collins playing in the NBA? Is it because he's past his prime, or is it because teams don't want the attention? And it's hard. I mean, if you talk to every coach, every general manager, team owners, and you ask them, what do you think about Jason Collins? They're like, well, we don't really have room for him on our team. They'll give you, right, the political answer. What any of them think, it's really difficult to know. Please.
Where do you see Magic Johnson in this thing?
Magic Johnson is a. I was asked about Magic Johnson and how Magic Johnson fits in. And Magic Johnson is an interesting example. I could have added him here. He's certainly someone I could have discussed. Of course, Magic Johnson announced that he had HIV in 1991 and retired, tried to make a little comeback. But Magic Johnson is, in many ways to me, sort of followed that Jackie Robinson path. It's I can protest or I can participate. And Magic Johnson took the participation route. And I think what's interesting about Magic Johnson is that prior to 1991, HIV and AIDS had a deep social stigma. It was associated with drug use. It was associated with deviant kinds of sexuality, right? But what Magic Johnson did was help to transform America's understanding about that disease, right? It's not something that afflicts a certain kind of people. It can afflict anyone. And Magic Johnson is someone who brought that disease out of the shadows and into the light and allowed us to have honest conversations about it. Yes, please.
Isn't Tim Tebow's situation similar to Sam's situation?
I was asked about Tim Tebow. I don't know. How do you figure?
Well, it's a political reason. Like, is he being excluded because he's not good enough, or is he being excluded because he stands for something that is
Yeah, I was asked, and Tim Tebow is, of course, associated with his outspoken Christianity, right? Tim Tebow is an interesting case. I have a colleague who teaches at Ohio University who has written a lot about Tim Tebow. I'll give you, I think, an academic's answer and then a sports fan's answer. The academic's answer is that it's difficult. And I think that many NFL teams would love to have Tim Tebow because he sells tickets. Tim Tebow could sell anything, right? Tim Tebow is a sought-after endorser, right? And he's tried to keep sort of a low profile while he's trying to keep his athletic career alive. Now, a sports fan's perspective is, I don't think he can throw. And that's a problem if you want to play quarterback.
He's from Florida State, though.
Yeah, it's true. I'm also a Florida State Seminole. Yeah, please.
Just real quickly on that, Chris Cluey actually likened himself to Tim Tebow and being excluded.
Really?
But my question was more, and you alluded to this, how you think social media has changed some of what you highlighted back in the 1960s when athletes needed to gain attention.
Right.
Now, if you think that social media might be a shortcut around some of those four.
Yeah, I think it can be. That's a good question. I was asked about social media and how social media now affects, how social media makes the athlete from the 60s different than the athlete of today. And I think that it's a dialectic, right? It's a problem that cuts against itself. Whereas on the one hand, social media can in fact be a shortcut. You can talk directly to athletes and they can talk directly to you. I can send a tweet that says, LeBron, great game, and he can tweet me back. It says, thanks, Abe, right? Now, we can communicate directly with our athletes. But I think the other problem is that it makes that task, this was what I was getting at, and I'm not sure if I said it so well, but what I was trying to get at the end about poetic world making, I think that the massive information flow that's in many ways accelerated and exacerbated by social media makes it that much more difficult for athletes to say something that is genuinely provocative, right? And so it's sort of it's images and ideas and snippets and 140-character sentences crash together in this sea of information where it might raise an eyebrow, right? But if it's 5 minutes old, we're not paying attention to it anymore. And so social media is powerful because it can connect athletes directly to fans. It can connect athletes directly to social or political interests, but it evaporates so quickly, right, that I wonder about whether or not it can stick. Like I said, it enchants, but it doesn't stick. That's my view of things. There was someone in the back over here. Please.
Do you have any interest in studying the impact of raised stadium issues or having on local government?
I was asked about the raised stadium issue. You know, I don't know. I got a phone call from someone whose name, honestly, I don't remember, about 3 years ago when I first got to USF, asking me about this. And I said, I'd be glad to meet, but I don't think these folks had their ducks in a row, and we never quite got the chance to meet. I'd be happy to talk about it, but, you know, I hope I wouldn't frustrate the people that I was talking to when I asked them how they're going to deliver power to the people. Right? Please.
1936, the Jesse Owens experience, was that a missed opportunity, or was it just a product of its time, impossible to develop anything other than as far as racing and athletics?
Okay, I was asked about Jesse Owens in 1936 and how Jesse Owens might have, whether it was a missed opportunity. Jesse Owens is a fascinating case. And Jesse Owens is someone who I honestly should have spent, I probably should have spent, if I had more time, I would have spent some time on Jesse Owens. So for those of you who don't know, Jesse Owens won 4 Olympic gold medals in 1936 in Berlin, right in front of Hitler, right? And so Hitler was pushing this whole Aryan supremacy business, and there's Jesse Owens, right, proving him wrong. And the thing about Jesse Owens, though, is that Jesse Owens came home as a patriot, right? And Jesse Owens fit very neatly and very deliberately into the State Department's plans, the U.S. State Department's plans to spread the American version of democracy. Jesse Owens was summoned in the Cold War fight, and Jesse Owens was quite a good Cold Warrior, right? There's a man whose name I forget, but I remember the name of the book. The book is called Globetrotting, and the book was released last year. And it's a scholar, it's a historian, who writes that Jesse Owens, among others, right, helped the State Department perform its task, but it was a PR stunt, right? The State Department had no interest in urging the Justice Department to change policy at home. The State Department just wanted to take advantage of black athletes, right, and show that there was equality here in the U.S. as opposed to equality in Russia. As for being a lost opportunity, I don't know, but Jesse Owens also fits into the Mexico City story, because John Carlos and Tommy Smith, after they did their salute in Mexico City, they were kicked out of Olympic Village. I mean, they were sent home. They were immediately turned into villains, right? And the guy that they brought in to talk to the rest of the athletes and say, don't do what John Carlos and Tommy Smith did, was Jesse Owens. Right, Jesse Owens, who was this powerful political figure in 1936, was now silencing political speech in 1968, which I think is a fascinating irony. And he is a really interesting character, and I'd love to, I could talk for days about Jesse Owens. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Please. I'll go back and use your alma mater here, FSU. Okay. The mascot, Seminoles.
Yeah.
The Seminoles endorse that.
Right.
It seems to work well for them.
Right.
Then you go to the Washington Redskins and you kind of get the other side of the coin.
Sure.
And certainly you see Marquette change their mascot.
Right.
Where do you see all this going, and is it...
I was asked about the FSU mascot, right, the Seminole mascot versus the Washington mascot, the Redskins, right? The Redskins is increasingly seen as a racial epithet. Washington sports writers don't even use the term anymore, as opposed to Seminole, which is embraced by the Seminole Indian tribe. Now, there's a man I should mention whose work, okay, it's not better than mine, but he writes more than I do. How about that? His name is Dave Zirin. Dave Zirin. Dave Zirin is a journalist. And Zirin writes for the online magazine The Nation. He also will write an article on Deadspin sort of whenever he feels like it. Dave Zirin has looked into this issue, and he makes the claim, and I haven't looked into it enough to know, but he makes the claim that the Seminole Nation's agreement with Florida State University is a purely economic arrangement, right, that essentially keeps the casinos open, right, and that economic arrangement doesn't necessarily reflect the interests of, let's call them, the rank and file, right, indigenous American people who may or may not identify with that term Seminole Indian. So whether or not, right, it's very difficult to say that one use is justifiable and the other use isn't. I would have a very difficult time splitting those hairs. I just say I went to FSU.
It's a hard problem to solve.
It's an incredibly difficult problem to solve because it speaks to questions not only of political correctness and offensiveness and everything like that, but also to people's identities, right? How people think of themselves and define themselves and present themselves to the outside world. Please.
There are many actors and members of the entertainment industry quite involved in politics. On the other hand, you don't see too much of professional athletes involved in politics. Why, in your opinion, is that the case?
I don't know. I think that maybe it's because Hollywood has a better sense of theater than sports. I don't know. Certainly there are a number of Hollywood actors and the like who are engaged in politics. You know, I'm not sure. And I'm actually not even entirely sure that's true. I also think that, like I said, it's harder to find the athletes. I don't know. One explanation, and I'm reluctant to give this explanation, but it's one that's frequently cited, so it's worthy of mention. And that is that athletes are socialized. And this is the argument made by the Texas history professor, that athletes are socialized as a young age to stay away from politics. Because if they get involved with politics, they put endorsement wealth at risk, they put salary wealth at risk, they put their possibilities of playing, and they're seen as a distraction for their team. Keep in mind that in North America, that sports that we value the most are team sports, right? All actors are free agents, right? They work alone. They make a movie, they go to the next movie, right? Athletes are team athletes, and I think that there's deep worry in, I imagine it depends on what team you go to, but I think that there's deep worry that if you go to one place, if you go to a particular team, that if you make too many waves, you won't be around too long. As opposed to Hollywood, it's just had that culture for quite a long time.
Time for one last question. Dr. Trailblazer.
Please.
I wonder if you'd comment on the, I guess it's an official, the delegation of open to gay athletes that I think it was the president sent to Sochi, Billie Jean King, Ryan Montano, and somebody else. I guess my question is this. I think it's a great gesture in a certain, from the point of view of the United States and our feelings and sentiments about that whole issue of gay athletes. Do you think it's going to make an impression internationally and also perhaps on the Russians themselves?
Internationally, perhaps. I don't know, I would say, enough about international politics to be able to judge. On Russia, probably not. Dave Zirin, in fact, writes extensively about how after Olympics are over, right, the city literally just forgets. And usually when a particular kind of security apparatus is put into place to protect the Olympic Village and everything else, that security apparatus sticks around, and it tends to be the case that once the Olympics leaves a city, that city becomes a police state. Happened in Los Angeles in 1984, right? He made the claim about London in 2012. As for Sochi, I mean, all I know is really what most of you know, which is that Russia's got troubles of its own. It's certainly dealing with this issue in the Ukraine. I view the delegation of gay athletes being sent to Sochi as domestic politics, not international politics. In other words, it strikes me, and I could be wrong about this, but it strikes me as a way for the present administration to make its case to the people at home, because this is where it gets coverage, right? So Billie Jean King appeared on 60 Minutes right before the Olympic Games started, right? There she is, right, giving an interview on 60 Minutes talking about her life, right? It was a way to sort of celebrate the progress at home. So we send the athletes there, we take pictures of them, and then beam them back home, right? So it strikes me as domestic politics, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about how the international news media works to really be able to make a claim about how it influences the outside world.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.